The glass of the conference table reflected the cold lights of the skyscraper. 15 executives in suits, a black woman in a navy blue blazer. The CEO banged his fist. The echo cut through the silence like a blade. "You're stupid." The words hung in the air conditioning. No one breathed. No one imagined that in less than 10 minutes, $2.5 billion would disappear from his account, and that she would leave there with her head held higher than ever. The Mont Blanc pen glided across the paper. Maya Johnson adjusted her glasses and checked the numbers for the third time. The 45th floor conference room smelled of Italian leather and ambition. 16 white men. Her CEO, Richard Whitman, drummed his fingers on the marble, his Rolex clicking against the cool surface. "The reports are ready," she said, holding out the organized folders. Her voice was firm, professional. 5 years as an executive secretary, MBA in finance. 0 errors in the last 2 years. Richard didn't even glance at the documents. His blue eyes pierced her like ice. "Did you check the third quarter figures?" The question was laced with impatience. Maya nodded. "I checked them 3 times, right, sir." He picked up a folder, flipped through it quickly, and slammed his hand down on the table. The sound echoed through the glass-enclosed room. "You're stupid. How could you miss something so simple?" The silence was immediate, brutal. 15 pairs of eyes turned to her, some amused, some embarrassed, most indifferent. Maya felt heat rise up her neck, but she didn't look away. The word stupid ricocheted through her mind like a stray bullet. Her grandmother always said, "Maya, when they try to put you down, remember who you are." She pressed her lips together. It wasn't the first time. At 28, she already knew her competence would be questioned 1,000 times more than that of any white man in the room. But it hurt. It always hurt. The attack came suddenly, vicious and public, just as she knew it would one day. Maya's fingers trembled imperceptibly as she organized the already perfectly aligned papers. The air conditioning hummed overhead, but she felt hot, very hot. Her hands, the same ones that typed 80 words per minute, that organized the schedules of millions, that never missed a deadline, now held sheets of paper like anchors in a stormy sea. She lowered her eyes, not out of submission, but to hide the storm brewing behind her brown irises. The marble table reflected the cold light of the Manhattan skyscrapers, creating shadows that danced across the $2.5 billion contracts. Contracts she had reviewed line by line for 3 nights straight. "I just wanted to help." His voice was quieter than intended. The words were lost in the vastness of the room, swallowed up by the architecture that seemed designed to diminish those outside its powerful world. Richard laughed, a dry, sharp sound. "Help? You nearly cost us a fortune with your incompetence." A few executives exchanged knowing glances. One of them, wearing a blue tie, whispered something to his colleague next to him. Maya caught the fragment. "You shouldn't be here anyway." The whisper was low, but deliberately audible, as it always was. Maya closed her eyes for a second. In the momentary darkness, she heard her mother's voice echoing through the years. "Maya, daughter, when the world calls you little, you grow inside. You grow so much that they can no longer ignore you." Her breathing deepened. She thought of her great-grandmother, who cleaned houses for men like Richard for 50 years, always silent, always invisible. She thought of her mother, who worked 2 jobs to pay her way through college. And she thought of herself, the first in her family to step onto that floor, into that world, at that table. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy. It was dignity. It was the time she needed to decide how she would respond, why she would respond. Not today, perhaps, but she would respond. She lifted her chin again, looking directly at Richard. Her eyes didn't apologize. They didn't ask for forgiveness. They simply existed, occupying a space that rightfully and competently belonged to her. Her silence hurt those who watched more than any scream ever could. The wall clock read 3:47 p.m. when the first smile appeared. James Patterson, Vice President of Operations, curled his lips slightly, almost imperceptible, but Maya caught it. She knew that smile, the same one she saw in the elevator when jokes were told in code, the same one that accompanied comments about diversity and quotas in the hallways. The room vibrated with a strange energy, as if 16 men were sharing an inside joke she would never understand, or would pretend not to. The silence after Richard's insult had lasted only seconds, but it was enough time for their masks to slip. Michael Chen, CFO, adjusted his glasses and looked down at his tablet. Thomas Rodriguez checked his phone. Small gestures of someone who knew something was wrong but chose convenient blindness. She shouldn't be here anyway. The words came from Andrew Morrison, sitting to Maya's left. He didn't whisper. He didn't try to hide it. He said it as if she were invisible, as if her ears weren't working, as if her presence there were a clerical error that would soon be corrected. Others nodded discreetly. David Walsh cleared his throat and shuffled through non-existent papers. The collective silence was deafening, not because it was empty, but because it was charged with complicity. 16 men witnessing a public humiliation and choosing to be complicit through inaction. Some out of cowardice, others out of convenience, all out of privilege. Richard watched the scene like a director satisfied with his play. He had orchestrated the moment perfectly. The public humiliation, the complacent audience, the isolated victim. Maya understood the game. Her mother had worked as a nurse in a private hospital for 20 years. She knew well the weight of those looks that judge, evaluate, and condemn without saying a word. "Maya," she would say, "sometimes they don't need to open their mouths to scream. Their silence is the loudest scream." She watched every face around the table. She memorized every expression, every averted glance, every knowing smile, because she knew that one day, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but one day, she would be across that table from them, and she would remember each and every one of them. Maya took a deep breath and stood tall. Her hands stopped shaking. Her shoulders squared. She wasn't just a black woman being humiliated in a room full of wealthy white men. She was the living memory of all who came before her, and the promise of all who would come after. The weight of the collective mockery was more devastating than any individual insult ever could be. Maya squeezed the cross pen between her fingers until her knuckles turned white. The pressure was calculated, controlled, as everything in her life had learned to be. Around the oval table, 16 breaths continued at different rates, but she felt as if she had been holding hers for minutes. The central air conditioning hummed monotonously, mingling with the distant rumble of traffic 45 floors below. Her eyes roamed the panoramic room, the glass walls that revealed Manhattan in all its vertical arrogance, the abstract paintings that cost more than her mother's annual salary, the subtle scent of English leather and distilled ambition. She was there, physically and professionally present, but she existed in a parallel dimension, visible only when convenient, audible only when necessary. Richard continued to flip through the reports with theatrical disdain, as if searching for more errors to point out. Each page turned sounded like a sentence. Maya knew there were no errors. She had checked the numbers 17 times the night before, cross-checking information until her eyes stung. But the truth was never the focal point of those moments. Loneliness didn't just come from being physically isolated. It came from the knowledge that none of them saw her as an equal. To them, she was a failed corporate diversity experiment, a quota that failed to meet expectations, a well-dressed intruder who insisted on occupying spaces where she didn't belong. Stay strong. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind like a mantra. Dolores Johnson had raised 6 children cleaning houses for families like these, invisible for decades, but always steadfast. Maya, when you're surrounded by wolves, don't become a lamb. Become a wolf too, but a better wolf. She took a deep breath, feeling the cold air fill her lungs. Each breath carried the strength of generations of women who had faced similar rooms, similar looks, similar judgments. She wasn't alone, never had been. She carried within her a lineage of resilience these men would never understand. Maya adjusted her posture, squaring her shoulders. Her fingers relaxed around the pen. She wouldn't lower her head. She wouldn't apologize for existing in this space she'd earned with merit. They might try to diminish her, but she'd been shaped by women who turned humiliation into fuel. Her gaze met Richard's for a moment. He expected to see her broken, submissive, remorseful. But what he found was something that disconcerted him. A woman who refused to disappear. Alone against everyone, she discovered that she had never been more accompanied. Richard stood with the theatricality of someone who knew all eyes were on him. The Italian leather chair creaked slightly as he pushed it back. His footsteps echoed on the marble floor, each sound calculated to intimidate. He walked slowly around the table, like a predator studying its prey, until he stopped directly behind Maya's chair. She could feel his presence, the expensive perfume mixed with the scent of power and arrogance. the controlled breathing of someone about to deliver the final blow. Richard's hands rested on the back of her chair, his fingers drumming on the leather inches from the back of her neck, a gesture that seemed casual but carried all the symbolic violence of centuries. The silence in the room was charged with anticipation. 16 men awaited their boss's next move, like an audience waiting for the end of a cruel play. People like that only slowed down the company's progress. Richard's words fell on Maya like molten lead. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't a direct attack. Worse, it was a sentence delivered with the coldness of someone who truly believed what they were saying. The tone was almost pedagogical, as if he were explaining a universal truth to the room. People like that. Not Maya, not she. People like that. As if Maya represented a whole category of people Richard considered unsuitable for that space. Racism distilled into two seemingly neutral words, but loaded with historical venom. Maya felt heat rise up her spine. Not from shame, but from an ancestral rage her great-grandmothers had swallowed for decades. The same rage her great-great-grandmothers carried in slave quarters, that her grandmothers stifled in other people's kitchens, that her mother disguised in hospital scrubs. For a moment, Maya saw herself at 8, listening to her teacher explain to the class why she had been selected for the special needs program. The same condescending intonation, the same certainty of superiority. People like that need extra help, the teacher had said, not realizing that Maya had the best grades in the class. Now, at 28 with an MBA and 5 years of impeccable experience, she heard the same song in a different key. The refrain never changed. You don't belong here. You are a concession, not a right. You are a mistake that needs to be righted. But Maya had learned something over the past 20 years. Richard's arrogance was also his weakness. Men like him always underestimated women like her. Always. His arrogance seemed infinite, and he was about to find out it wasn't. The sound was barely perceptible at first, a subtle scrape of leather against marble, but in the sheer tension of the room, every noise echoed like thunder. Alexander Petrov, the Russian investor who had remained silent throughout the meeting, pushed back his chair with deliberate slowness. He was different from the other executives, older, with impeccably combed gray hair, and blue eyes that had seen revolutions and empires crumble. His hands, marked by age but still steady, rested on the desk as he stood. The Patek Philippe on his wrist caught the New York afternoon light, reflecting small golden arcs on the glass walls. His movement was like a stone dropped into a still pond. All side conversations instantly ceased. All eyes turned to him. Richard stopped walking behind Maya's chair and frowned, as if trying to decipher what was happening. This is unacceptable. Alexander's voice cut through the air with the authority of someone who commanded billions, not millions. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't an explosion. It was a cold, final statement, laden with the weight of someone who had built an empire from scratch and knew exactly the value of respect. He looked directly at Richard, completely ignoring the other 15 men around the table. His blue eyes locked with laser-like intensity. In 40 years of business, across 3 continents, I have never witnessed such a lack of professionalism. The silence that followed was unlike any other. It was no longer the complicit silence of executives watching a humiliation. It was the tense silence of powerful men realizing that the dynamic had completely shifted. Richard opened his mouth to respond, but no sound came out. Maya felt something stir in her chest, a sensation she hadn't experienced in a long time. It wasn't relief. It wasn't yet victory. It was the surreal realization that, for the first time in years, someone had taken her side, not out of charity or corporate politics, but out of basic human decency. She looked at Alexander and saw something that surprised her. He wasn't looking at her with pity or condescension. He was looking at Richard with genuine contempt, as if the billionaire CEO were the smallest person in that imposing room. Maya took a deep breath, and for the first time since Richard had begun his attack, she felt like she could breathe fully. The air was no longer thin. The space no longer felt hostile. The room froze when the most powerful word in the world was finally uttered. Unacceptable. Alexander took 2 steps toward the center of the room, each movement calculated like a chess move. The afternoon sun cast a golden halo around his silhouette, transforming him into an almost cinematic figure against the backdrop of Manhattan's skyscrapers. His Italian shoes echoed on the marble with the cadence of a metronome marking time. Richard remained standing behind Maya's chair, but his posture changed. His shoulders tensed slightly, like an animal sensing the presence of a larger predator. His hands, which seconds before had drummed arrogantly on the leather, now hung uncertainly at his sides. Respect isn't optional in serious business. Alexander regarded Richard with the coldness of someone who had survived the fall of the Soviet Union and built fortunes on the ruins of empires. "Or you just lost a $2.5 billion contract." The sentence fell upon the room like a neutron bomb. It destroyed everything without leaving a visible trace. 15 executives held their breath simultaneously. The air conditioning continued to hum, but the sound seemed to amplify, filling the void left by the unspoken words. "You can't do this." Richard tried to regain control, but his voice betrayed barely concealed desperation. "We have signed contracts." "Legal obligations." Alexander smiled, a cold smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Moral conduct clause, paragraph 16. Did you read it before signing?" He pulled his phone from his pocket with the ease of someone who had performed similar maneuvers hundreds of times. "My lawyer is already canceling everything." The room's reaction was instantaneous and brutal. The executives, who had been laughing at Richard's comments minutes before, now avoided all eye contact with him. James Patterson discreetly checked LinkedIn on his phone. Michael Chen began organizing his papers as if already planning a strategic exit. The room that had once breathed complicity now exuded corporate panic. Maya watched the transformation with a mixture of fascination and poetic justice. She thought of her great-grandmother, who cleaned houses like this, invisible to men like Richard, but who always said, "Maya, life has a funny way of balancing the books. It may take a while, but it always does." She didn't feel sadistic pleasure. She felt something deeper, confirmation that her dignity was valuable, that her humanity mattered, that there were people in the world willing to defend basic human decorum, even when it cost billions. Maya slowly rose from her chair. For the first time since Richard began his attack, she was physically on the same level as the other men in the room. Her eyes met each executive's, one by one, etching their faces into her memory. Alexander turned to her and nodded slightly, a barely perceptible gesture, but one filled with mutual respect between professionals. Sometimes justice comes disguised as consequences. Alexander gathered the contract documents with precise, deliberate movements. Each paper he folded and placed in the Italian leather briefcase sounded like a sentence being executed. The sound of paper against paper echoed in the silent room with the intensity of gunfire. His fingers, scarred by decades of dealing with oligarchs and presidents, handled the documents as if they were fragile relics, now worth nothing more than recycled paper. Richard watched every movement with the expression of a man watching his house burn down. Sweat began to form small beads on his forehead, despite the frigid air conditioning. His hands trembled imperceptibly, a tremor Maya noticed because she had learned to recognize signs of nervousness in powerful men. $2.5 billion less in your account." Alexander closed the briefcase with a sharp snap and headed for the door. He didn't look back. He didn't offer a second chance. He showed no remorse. The sentence fell on Richard like a gavel. He tried to follow Alexander, stumbling slightly over his own feet. "Wait, we can talk about this." "It was a misunderstanding." Alexander stopped in the doorway without turning around. "It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was who you really are." The glass door closed behind him with a final sound, like a tombstone sealing a grave. What followed was the most deafening silence Maya had ever witnessed in a corporate office. 15 powerful men, each worth millions, sat around a marble table, completely speechless. The air conditioning seemed louder. The traffic 45 floors below seemed closer. Everything amplified by the emptiness left by billions of dollars evaporating in seconds. James Patterson was the first to stand, muttering something about another meeting. Michael Chen followed, then Thomas Rodriguez. One by one, like rats abandoning a ship, the executives found excuses to escape Richard's toxic presence. Maya sat, watching the collapse with a serenity that surprised her. She thought of her mother, who always said, "Maya, life has its own mathematics. Sometimes it takes time, but the math always adds up." 20 years working as a nurse, listening to doctors treat her like chattel, but never losing her dignity. Now Maya understood what her mother meant. It wasn't about revenge. It was about consequence. It was about the universe rebalancing a scale that had been tilted by arrogance and prejudice. Maya slowly stood up and began organizing her own papers. Richard watched her with the eyes of a man who had just realized he had completely underestimated the situation. She picked up her briefcase, the same briefcase she'd been carrying for 5 years, with a family photo discreetly taped inside. 3 generations of Johnson women stared back at her, reminding her that she'd never been alone on this journey. Laughter turned to ash, power shifted, and the price of arrogance was exacted. Maya closed the briefcase with a gentle but definitive movement. The sound of leather meeting leather echoed in the nearly empty room. Only she and Richard remained, like 2 survivors of a corporate wreckage. The golden Manhattan afternoon light streamed in through the panoramic windows, creating a cinematic contrast between light and shadow, between silent victory and resounding defeat. She rose from her chair for the last time as an employee of that company. Her movements were calculated, dignified, imbued with an elegance that transcended any corporate protocol. Her navy blue blazer fit perfectly around her straight shoulders. Her mid-heel shoes tapped the marble with the confidence of a woman who knew exactly who she was and what she was worth. Maya walked to the door, but stopped before leaving. She turned to Richard with the serenity of a queen bidding farewell to a kingdom that was never worthy of her. Her eyes met his for the last time, not as secretary to boss, but as human being to human being. Stupid, never again. Her voice was firm, clear, filled with decades of pent-up dignity. It wasn't a battle cry. It was a declaration of independence. Richard opened his mouth to respond, but no sound came out. For the first time in years, he was completely speechless in the face of a woman he had tried to diminish. Maya smiled, not bitterly, not vengefully, but with the deep satisfaction of someone who had just freed herself from a prison she hadn't even known she lived in. She thought of her great-grandmother who cleaned houses like this for 50 years, always invisible. She thought of her grandmother who raised 7 children as a domestic worker, always silent. She thought of her mother who faced down arrogant doctors for 2 decades, always diplomatic. And she thought of herself, the first in her lineage to have the privilege of leaving a room of power by her own choice, with her head held high and her dignity intact. Maya wasn't just leaving a job. She was breaking an ancestral cycle of silencing. She was occupying a space her ancestors never could, the space of response, of retort, of the final word. At the reception desk, a young black intern watched her with barely concealed admiration. Maya gave her a discreet wave, a simple gesture that carried generations of strength, a silent promise that the path was being paved for those who would come after. Maya Johnson left that building as she had entered it 5 years earlier, a competent and dignified black woman. The difference was that now she knew, and the world knew too, that her presence was not a concession, not a favor, not an experiment. It was right. It was conquest. It was power. There she lost nothing. He lost much more than $2.5 billion. Tell us in the comments, have you ever witnessed a situation like this? Someone being publicly humiliated because of prejudice? How did you react? Your experience may inspire others to act differently. If this story touched you, it's because you understand that respect is not negotiable. How many times have you seen someone being put down at work, at school, on the street, and remained silent? How many Maya Johnsons are there around you waiting for someone to stand up and say, "This is unacceptable"? Change begins when we stop being silent spectators. Turn on notifications so as not to miss any story of resistance and justice. Share this video for anyone who needs to hear that their dignity is non-negotiable. Write below a situation in which you wish you had had the courage to act. Or better yet, tell us about a time when you took action and made a difference. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how much money you have. It matters how much humanity you carry.